when time brought them back together. The wedding was never supposed to be about them. It was meant to be a celebration of two lives beginning something brave together, a promise spoken under open skies and gentle music. Yet sometimes, life quietly rearranges its focus without asking permission. On a sun-washed afternoon overlooking the Mediterranean, where the sea shimmered like polished glass and white stone terraces glowed under drifting clouds, fate placed two familiar souls in the same space again, after years of silence that had never truly been empty. Sandra arrived without spectacle, no dramatic entrance, no pause for cameras. She moved through the courtyard with the calm grace of someone who had learned that peace mattered more than applause. The pale blue of her dress caught the breeze as if the air itself recognized her presence, and for a brief moment she stopped near the edge of the terrace, eyes drifting toward the horizon. Weddings had a way of doing that to her, of stirring memories she usually kept folded neatly inside herself. Not regrets, not sorrow. Just moments that had passed too quietly to ever fully leave. Keanu arrived the same way. Unannounced, unhurried, dressed simply, as though this were any other day he had chosen to show up for something that mattered. He stood for a moment beneath an arch of climbing roses, hands loosely folded, watching guests gather, listening to laughter ripple across the stone. There was a stillness about him, the kind that didn't demand attention but drew it anyway, because calm had become rare in a world addicted to noise. Neither of them knew the other was there, at least not yet, and somehow that felt right. Life had always worked best between them when it unfolded naturally without scripts or expectations. It happened quietly. Sandra turned from the sea at the same moment Keanu stepped forward from the shade. Their eyes met, not with shock, not with surprise, but with recognition so immediate it felt like something remembered rather than discovered. Time seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether it should keep moving. For a second, neither spoke. Then Sandra smiled, not the kind meant for cameras, but the small, genuine smile that reached her eyes before her lips even moved. "You made it," she said, her voice steady but warm, like she had always known he would. Keanu nodded, returning the smile with one just as understated. "I wouldn't miss this," he replied. He paused, then added softly, "It's good to see you." Those 5 words carried years inside them. Years of parallel lives, separate journeys, unspoken care that never faded even when distance grew. They didn't rush to fill the space with stories or explanations. They didn't need to. Some connections didn't require maintenance to survive. They simply waited. Around them, the wedding preparations continued. Guests mingled, music tested its volume, sunlight danced across glassware. Somewhere nearby, Anna laughed, her joy bright and unguarded, while Tom listened with the easy presence of someone deeply grounded. Their happiness filled the air, not loud, not forced, but sincere. It was the kind of love that didn't perform, and that made it powerful. Sandra and Keanu found seats beside each other as the ceremony began, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, yet neither leaned in. Respect had always been the quiet language between them. As vows were spoken, Sandra watched Anna's face soften with emotion, her voice steady even as her hands trembled slightly. It reminded Sandra of something she had learned long ago, that courage often appeared not as confidence, but as the decision to speak anyway. Keanu noticed Sandra's hands resting calmly in her lap, fingers loosely intertwined. He remembered those hands, how they once waved him over during long shoots, how they reached out instinctively to help without thinking twice. He leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "They look happy." Sandra nodded. "They are," she replied. "You can tell when love doesn't need to convince anyone." The ceremony ended in quiet applause that felt more like gratitude than celebration. As guests rose, a sudden gust of wind swept across the terrace, lifting table linens and scattering a stack of programs near the aisle. Before anyone else reacted, Sandra stood, already moving to gather them. Keanu followed without hesitation, crouching beside her as they collected the papers together. A young server nearby looked flustered, apologizing repeatedly, but Sandra only smiled, handing the programs back neatly stacked. "It's okay," she said gently. "The wind just wanted to be part of the day." Keanu added with a calm grin, "Happens to the best of us." The server froze for a second, recognition dawning, then laughed, relieved, grateful, human again. Someone snapped a photo without realizing it would later be shared around the world, not because of fame, but because of what it showed. 2 people choosing kindness when no one asked them to. As the reception unfolded under strings of warm lights, Sandra and Keanu stayed close, not clinging, not avoiding, just present. They spoke with guests, listened more than they talked, and somehow made everyone feel seen. An elderly woman shivered as evening air cooled, and Sandra immediately draped her shawl around her shoulders without comment. A child struggled with a knotted tie, and Keanu knelt to fix it, explaining each step as if it were the most important task in the world. No announcements followed these moments. No speeches highlighted them, and yet they lingered in the atmosphere, shaping the night in subtle ways. Later, as music softened and laughter deepened into something slower, Sandra stepped away toward the balcony overlooking the sea. Fireflies hovered near the edge of the garden, tiny sparks of light dancing above the dark water. Keanu joined her, resting his arms on the railing beside hers. "Funny," she said quietly, watching the horizon, "how life circles back when you stop chasing it." He nodded. "Maybe it waits until you're ready to notice." They stood there in shared silence, the kind that didn't ask to be broken. Below them, waves moved steadily, indifferent to time, patient in their rhythm. Sandra inhaled deeply, feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest, not longing, not regret, but recognition. Some meetings weren't about reopening the past. Some were about understanding why it had never truly closed. Behind them, laughter rose again, music swelled, and lights shimmered brighter. The wedding carried on, beautiful and complete. But for Sandra and Keanu, something else had quietly begun, not a story meant for headlines, but one rooted in presence, empathy, and the simple courage of showing up. And neither of them yet realized how deeply this reunion would ripple. Through their lives, through strangers they hadn't met, and through a world desperately hungry for gentleness. The night was far from over, and this was only the beginning. The silence that spoke louder. The night stretched on with a softness that felt almost unreal, as if the wedding had created a small pocket of calm that the outside world couldn't reach. The music slowed, conversations deepened, and the sea below the terrace reflected moonlight like a living mirror. Sandra remained on the balcony for a long moment after the others drifted back toward the garden, letting the air cool her thoughts. She wasn't overwhelmed, but she was aware of how rare it felt to be present without expectation, how strange it was that standing beside Keanu again didn't awaken chaos, only clarity. That realization unsettled her more than any headline ever could. Keanu sensed her distance without needing to look. He had always been good at reading the spaces between words, the pauses where people hid their truths. He stayed a respectful step away, watching the water, giving her room to breathe. Years ago, he might have filled the silence with humor or distraction, afraid of what stillness might reveal. Now he understood that silence wasn't something to escape, it was something to honor. When Sandra finally spoke, her voice was steady but thoughtful, as though she were speaking as much to herself as to him. She told him how time had taught her to let go of things she couldn't control, how success no longer felt like protection, and how solitude had become both refuge and teacher. She admitted that there were moments she had wondered if distance had been a mistake, not because of romance left unfinished, but because of a friendship she had quietly mourned without ever naming the loss. Keanu listened without interruption, his expression calm but deeply attentive. When she finished, he didn't rush to respond. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, explaining that he had never walked away emotionally, only stepped back out of respect. He confessed that he believed some connections were meant to breathe, not be held tightly, and that sometimes the most meaningful loyalty was quiet patience rather than constant presence. There was no defense in his tone, no justification, only truth offered without demand. Their conversation was interrupted not by drama, but by a small moment of humanity that seemed to find them wherever they went. A young member of the event staff approached nervously, explaining that a guest had become unwell near the garden path and didn't want to cause a scene. Without hesitation, Sandra followed her, Keanu right behind. Their conversation naturally paused but not lost. They found the guest seated on a low stone wall, pale and embarrassed, insisting she didn't want attention. Sandra knelt beside her, speaking gently, grounding her with calm reassurance, while Keanu quietly arranged water and alerted the event medic without drawing notice. The moment passed quietly, efficiently, without applause. The guest was fine, grateful, and almost shocked when she realized who had helped her. Sandra brushed it off with warmth, telling her that kindness didn't need names attached to it, while Keanu simply smiled and wished her a peaceful rest of the evening. As they walked back toward the terrace, neither commented on what they had done. They didn't need to. Helping had always been instinctive for them, not performative. As the night edged closer to its end, fireworks were announced, drawing guests toward the far edge of the garden. Colors exploded above the sea, red and gold dissolving into smoke and light, reflected in the water below. Sandra stood still, watching the display with quiet awe, but her attention kept drifting inward. She felt the weight of years pressing gently against her chest, not painfully, but insistently, as if something inside her was asking to be acknowledged at last. Keanu stood beside her again, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, though neither moved. He noticed her stillness, the way her breath slowed as she watched the sky. He spoke quietly almost to the moment itself, saying that life had a strange way of returning unfinished conversations when people were finally strong enough to listen. Sandra turned to him then, meeting his gaze fully, and for the first time that night the air between them felt charged, not with romance but with recognition. She told him that seeing him again hadn't reopened wounds as she once feared. Instead, it had reminded her of who she was before life taught her caution. She admitted that she had spent years protecting her peace so carefully that she sometimes forgot how to share it. Her words weren't confessions meant to bind him to her. They were truths she needed to hear herself say out loud. Keanu responded not with promises, but with understanding. He told her that peace wasn't something meant to be guarded forever, that sometimes it grew stronger when shared with the right people in the right way. He reminded her that connection didn't have to mean obligation, and that choosing presence didn't require surrendering independence. His voice carried no pressure, only possibility. As the final firework faded and darkness settled gently over the garden, applause echoed briefly before dissolving into quiet satisfaction. Guests began to depart, laughter softening into farewells. Sandra and Keanu remained where they were, letting the crowd thin around them. The wedding had ended, but something within both of them felt newly awake. When they finally turned back toward the villa, Sandra felt lighter, though nothing concrete had changed. No declarations had been made, no paths defined. Yet she understood something essential. Time had not taken anything from them. It had simply prepared them to meet again without fear. The night closed not with certainty, but with calm. And for the first time in years, both of them sensed that whatever came next would not be driven by longing or regret, but by intention, empathy, and the quiet courage to stay present when life offered a second meeting. The story was no longer about what had been missed. It was becoming about what could finally be lived. When morning reveals what night awakened. Morning arrived gently, as if the world itself was careful not to disturb what the night had set in motion. Sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, warming the quiet rooms of the villa where guests slowly woke, carrying with them fragments of laughter, music, and moments that already felt like memories. Sandra stood alone on her balcony, wrapped in a light shawl, holding a cup of coffee she had barely touched. Below her, the sea was calm and endless, stretching into the horizon with the same patience it had shown the night before. She breathed deeply, aware that something within her had shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the kind of permanence that only came from truth finally being acknowledged. She wasn't thinking about headlines or speculation, though she knew they would come. She was thinking about stillness, about how rare it felt to wake without resistance, without the instinct to armor herself against the day. Seeing Keanu again had not stirred confusion the way she once feared it might. Instead, it had clarified something she had quietly struggled to name for years. That distance had not protected her heart as much as she believed. It had preserved her independence, yes, but it had also narrowed her world in subtle ways she was only now beginning to see. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, Keanu stood there holding 2 cups of coffee, one extended toward her with a faint, familiar smile. He hadn't dressed for attention, only for comfort, and there was an ease in his presence that made the morning feel less fragile. She laughed softly, surprised not by his gesture but by how natural it felt. He remembered how she liked it, not because he tried to, but because some things stayed with you when they mattered. They sat together on the balcony, not facing each other, but the sea letting silence stretch comfortably between them. The kind of silence that didn't need to be filled because it wasn't empty. Eventually, Keanu spoke about the wedding, about how he admired the way love looked when it was built on respect rather than performance. Sandra listened, then shared her own thoughts about how society had confused vulnerability with weakness, and how many people learned too late that protecting oneself too fiercely could become another form of isolation. Their conversation was interrupted by urgency rather than ceremony. A staff member hurried toward them, explaining that an accident had occurred near the dock where equipment was being removed. A worker had slipped and injured his leg, and though help was on the way, he was frightened and in pain. Sandra and Keanu didn't hesitate. They followed immediately, moving without instruction, without concern for who might be watching. When they arrived, Sandra knelt beside the man, speaking calmly, grounding him with reassurance, while Keanu stabilized his position and coordinated with medical staff. Their actions were efficient, composed, and deeply human, shaped not by instinct to help because of who they were, but because help was needed. When the situation was resolved and the worker was safely attended to, the small crowd dispersed, murmuring gratitude. Sandra remained seated on a wooden bench near the water, her dress lightly damp from the spray, her expression thoughtful rather than shaken. Keanu sat beside her, placing a towel over her shoulders without comment. She looked at him then, really looked, and understood something clearly for the first time in years. This was what trust felt like when it wasn't demanded, only offered. This was what partnership looked like when it wasn't labeled, only lived. As the morning unfolded, news of the wedding began spreading beyond the villa walls. Phones buzzed, notifications multiplied, and speculation found its way into every corner of the internet. Photos circulated, some polished, some candid, but the ones that resonated most were the quiet ones. Sandra kneeling to comfort a stranger, Keanu lifting equipment alongside staff, both of them present in moments that had nothing to do with celebrity. The world noticed not because they wanted to be seen, but because they hadn't tried to hide kindness behind image. Sandra became aware of the attention later when she finally checked her phone. She scrolled through messages slowly, absorbing not the curiosity but the tone. People weren't demanding explanations. They were sharing stories. Stories of being reminded to slow down, to help someone without recording it, to believe again that decency could exist without an agenda. That realization unsettled her in the best possible way. It made her understand that impact didn't always require intention. Sometimes it simply required authenticity. That afternoon, as guests prepared to depart, Sandra and Keanu walked the garden paths one last time. They spoke about the years they had spent building separate lives, the lessons learned in solitude, and the way this reunion hadn't undone their growth but honored it. Sandra admitted that she had once believed reconnection meant reopening wounds, but now saw that it could also mean closure. Closure not of endings, but of misunderstandings long carried without reason. Keanu told her that he never believed people met again by accident, only by timing. That perhaps the version of themselves they were now could finally meet without fear, without expectation, without the pressure to become something other than what they already were. His words didn't promise permanence. They offered possibility, and Sandra realized that was enough. As the car arrived to take them toward their separate destinations, Sandra paused before getting in. She looked back at the villa, at the sea, at the place where something quiet and powerful had been set in motion. She turned to Keanu and thanked him, not for the coffee, not for the help, but for the presence, for showing up without conditions, for reminding her that connection didn't have to mean surrender. He smiled, nodding gently, and told her that some of the most meaningful journeys didn't begin with decisions, but with awareness. As they parted, there was no heaviness, no anxiety about what came next. Only calm and a shared understanding that whatever unfolded would be guided not by noise, but by intention. As the car pulled away, Sandra rested her head against the window, watching the landscape blur softly past. She felt something rare settle inside her, a sense of alignment. Not certainty, not romance, but readiness. The readiness to live openly again, to let kindness be seen without fear, and to trust that the quiet moments she once guarded so carefully were meant to be shared after all. The reunion had not rewritten the past. It had given the present permission to breathe. When the world watched and they chose quiet. By the time Sandra returned home, the world had already begun forming its own version of the story. Screens filled with softened images from the wedding, moments slowed and replayed until strangers felt entitled to meaning that didn't belong to them. Headlines speculated gently at first, then boldly, as if repetition could turn curiosity into certainty. Sandra noticed it all from a distance, sitting in the quiet of her living room, the late afternoon light stretching across the floor like a calm reminder that reality still existed beyond the noise. She wasn't angry, nor was she defensive. What unsettled her was how quickly people mistook visibility for permission, how easily tenderness became something to consume rather than respect. Keanu experienced it similarly, though in his own way. He read fewer headlines, avoided more conversations, but felt the weight all the same. It wasn't fear that stirred in him, it was responsibility. He had learned long ago that attention could distort even the purest intentions, and he understood that whatever had quietly begun between him and Sandra now faced a different kind of test. not one of emotion, but of integrity. How they responded to being watched would matter far more than what anyone assumed. They met again days later, not for spectacle, but for purpose. A small community center on the edge of the city was hosting a fundraiser for families affected by recent hardships, the kind of event that rarely attracted cameras unless someone famous appeared. Sandra arrived early, blending into the preparation, helping volunteers arrange chairs, listening more than she spoke. Keanu arrived quietly, carrying boxes of donated supplies, greeting people by name once introduced, making himself useful rather than visible. Neither announced their presence. They didn't need to. As the evening unfolded, it became clear that their appearance had been noticed anyway. Phones came out discreetly, whispers spread, but something unexpected happened. Instead of escalating into frenzy, the room softened. People watched them not as icons, but as examples. Children approached cautiously, elders smiled with recognition rather than awe, and conversations shifted toward gratitude instead of speculation. Sandra spent time with a woman who had lost her job, listening patiently without interruption, while Keanu helped a group of teenagers assemble care packages, encouraging them with quiet humor and genuine attention. At one point, an organizer suggested inviting them both on stage to say a few words, believing their presence would inspire donations. Sandra hesitated, glancing at Keanu, and he understood immediately. He gently declined on their behalf, suggesting instead that the families share their own stories. The organizer agreed, and the room filled with voices that mattered more than celebrity ever could. Sandra felt something settle into place inside her then. This was the line she had spent years learning how to hold, the boundary between being seen and being useful. Later that night, as they stepped outside into the cooling air, Sandra spoke openly about her fear that the world would turn something gentle into something demanding. She admitted that she had worked hard to protect her inner life, not because she was afraid of love, but because she was afraid of losing herself to expectation again. Keanu listened without interrupting, then told her that he believed meaning survived attention only when people refused to perform it. He reminded her that they didn't owe the world a story, only honesty with themselves. Their conversation was interrupted when a young boy approached, clutching a folded drawing. He handed it to Sandra shyly, explaining that he had drawn her and Keanu helping people because it made his mother smile for the first time in weeks. Sandra knelt to thank him, her eyes misting despite her smile, while Keanu praised the boy's creativity, telling him that noticing kindness was a talent worth keeping. When the child ran back to his family, Sandra held the drawing for a long moment, realizing that impact didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived quietly, asking only to be acknowledged. In the days that followed, both of them made a conscious decision. They stopped avoiding attention, but they also stopped feeding it. They continued showing up to meaningful spaces, continued helping where help was needed, and continued refusing to explain themselves. When asked direct questions, they redirected the conversation toward causes, toward people, toward purpose. Slowly, the tone around them began to change. What could have turned into obsession softened into admiration, then into something quieter and more respectful. Sandra found herself sleeping better, feeling lighter, not because uncertainty had vanished, but because she no longer felt the need to outrun it. Keanu felt the same, grounded by the realization that connection didn't require declaration to be real. What mattered was consistency, not clarity for strangers. One evening, as they sat together after another long day of quiet work, Sandra admitted something she hadn't said aloud before. She told him that for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of letting something grow naturally, without labels, without urgency. She told him she trusted herself again. Keanu smiled at that, not because of what it implied for them, but because of what it meant for her. He told her that whatever shape their connection took, it would be built on choice, not momentum. As the city settled into night outside the window, Sandra realized that the world watching them no longer felt like pressure. It felt like a reminder that kindness still resonated, that gentleness still mattered, and that choosing quiet in a loud world was an act of courage. This chapter of their story was not about romance declared or futures defined. It was about restraint, intention, and the strength it took to remain human when the world expected performance. And in choosing quiet, they discovered something rare. They were no longer reacting to life. They were finally living it on their own terms. The moment they stopped running, time did what it always did. It kept moving, indifferent to the questions people asked and the assumptions they made. Weeks passed, then months, and the world's attention slowly shifted to louder stories, newer distractions. Yet beneath the surface of that noise, something steady was taking shape, unannounced and unforced. Sandra felt it most clearly during ordinary days, when she found herself no longer bracing for loneliness or guarding her peace as if it were fragile glass. Instead, her calm felt solid, rooted, as though it had finally found a place where it could rest without fear of being disturbed. Her conversations with Keanu became less frequent in number but deeper in substance. They didn't speak every day, and neither expected the other to fill silence with reassurance. When they did talk, it was with intention, about work that mattered, about people they had met who quietly carried burdens, about the strange relief that came with choosing honesty over certainty. Sandra noticed that she no longer measured her words, no longer filtered her thoughts to protect herself from disappointment. With him, she felt safe enough to be unfinished. One afternoon, after a long day spent volunteering quietly at a local shelter, Sandra invited Keanu to walk with her through a nearby park. The city hummed beyond the trees, but inside the paths felt untouched by urgency. Leaves shifted underfoot, sunlight filtered through branches, and for a long time they walked without speaking. Sandra eventually broke the silence, not nervously, not dramatically, but with the calm confidence of someone who had reached a truth and was ready to share it. She told him that she had spent years believing strength meant independence at all costs, that needing no one was the same as being whole. But she had come to understand that resilience didn't disappear when you allowed someone to walk beside you. Sometimes it deepened. Keanu listened, hands in his pockets, gaze steady but thoughtful. When he responded, he spoke about his own habit of retreating into solitude, not out of pain, but out of caution. He admitted that he had often mistaken distance for wisdom, believing that staying quiet was always the kindest choice. But seeing her again had reminded him that presence could also be an act of respect, that staying wasn't always intrusion, it could be invitation. They stopped near a small pond where children were tossing pebbles into the water, laughing as ripples spread outward. Sandra watched them for a moment, then said something that surprised even her. She told him she wasn't afraid of what people might think anymore, not because she had grown immune to judgment, but because she finally understood that living carefully had cost her moments she could never reclaim. She didn't want to spend the rest of her life protecting herself from experiences that could make her more human. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He studied the water, the way ripples overlapped and faded without conflict, and then he said quietly that he didn't want to be another chapter she felt she had to explain or justify. He wanted whatever existed between them to be chosen freely, without pressure, without expectation, without being shaped by anyone else's narrative. Sandra met his gaze and told him that was exactly why she had spoken. Not to demand anything, but to stop pretending that silence was always safety. That evening, something unexpected tested the resolve they were beginning to trust. News broke of a crisis affecting a community they had both quietly supported for years. Funding had been withdrawn suddenly, and families were at risk of losing essential resources. Calls were made, meetings arranged, and within hours, Sandra and Keanu found themselves working side by side again, coordinating help, leveraging connections, moving quickly but thoughtfully. There were no cameras present, no public acknowledgement, just people doing what needed to be done because they could. As the night stretched into early morning, exhaustion settled in, but so did clarity. Sandra realized that this was what alignment felt like, not grand gestures, not declarations, but shared values in motion. Keanu felt it too, recognizing that standing next to her in moments of urgency felt natural, not heavy. There was no confusion, no performance, only trust built through action. When the immediate crisis passed and the last call ended, they sat quietly in a dimly lit room, the city still asleep outside. Sandra leaned back, closing her eyes briefly, and said softly that she didn't want to keep circling what mattered anymore. She didn't want to run from meaning simply because it carried risk. Keanu turned to her then, his voice calm but resolute, and told her that he wasn't interested in rushing toward certainty, but he was willing to stay present for possibility. He told her that choosing something slowly didn't make it weaker, it made it real. Sandra opened her eyes and smiled, not with relief, but with recognition. She understood that nothing dramatic had happened, and yet everything had changed. They hadn't promised futures or rewritten histories. They had simply decided not to retreat when life offered connection again. As dawn approached and light began to soften the edges of the room, Sandra felt something settle into place that she hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't excitement or anticipation. It was peace, the kind that came from no longer fighting yourself. This chapter of their story didn't end with certainty. It ended with choice. And for the first time, neither of them felt the urge to run from what that choice might become. The kind of love that leaves the world softer. The weeks that followed did not announce themselves with milestones or dramatic shifts, and that was exactly what made them meaningful. Life resumed its familiar rhythm, work, obligations, moments of solitude, but something within both Sandra and Keanu had changed permanently. They moved through their days with a steadier presence, no longer bracing against connection or guarding themselves from possibility. What they shared did not demand constant attention. It existed quietly, like a steady current beneath the surface, shaping decisions without asking to be named. They continued to work together on causes that mattered, often without planning to. One invitation led to another, one quiet act of service revealed another need. Sometimes they arrived together, sometimes separately, but their intentions aligned so naturally that it felt less like coordination and more like instinct. Sandra noticed how easily their strengths complemented each other, how compassion flowed into action without friction. Keanu noticed how her empathy never overwhelmed him, how it grounded him instead of pulling him apart. There was no sense of sacrifice, only balance. Public attention surfaced now and then, as it always would, but it no longer dictated their emotional climate. When asked questions, they answered gently and honestly without feeding curiosity or resisting it. They spoke about kindness, about slowing down, about showing up for people when no one was watching. The absence of spectacle became the story itself, and slowly the world adjusted its expectations. What couldn't be consumed easily lost its power to be exploited. One evening, months after the wedding that had brought them back into each other's orbit, Sandra invited Keanu to her home for a quiet dinner. There were no guests, no agenda, just shared food and conversation that wandered naturally between memory and reflection. At one point, Sandra admitted that she no longer felt the need to define what they were becoming. She said that labels had once felt like protection, but now they felt unnecessary. What mattered was how she felt when she woke up, calm, honest, present. Keanu responded with something equally simple and profound. He told her that he had spent much of his life believing that the best way to love people was to step aside, to avoid complicating their paths. But standing beside her again had taught him that love could also be a form of stewardship, not ownership, not control, but shared responsibility for leaving each other stronger than before. He said that whatever shape their connection took, it had already changed him for the better. Later that night, they sat outside under a quiet sky, the city humming distantly. Sandra spoke about legacy, not in terms of fame or accomplishments, but in terms of impact. She said she wanted to be remembered not for what she achieved, but for how she made people feel when no one was keeping score. Keanu nodded, telling her that he believed kindness was the only thing that outlived time, because it traveled from person to person long after its origin was forgotten. That belief would soon be tested in the most unexpected way. A letter arrived weeks later from a small community that had benefited indirectly from their quiet efforts. It wasn't addressed to their names, but to those who showed up when it mattered. The letter spoke of restored hope, of people who had begun helping each other because they had been helped without judgment. Sandra read it slowly, tears forming without drama, and realized that this was what alignment looked like, not recognition, but ripple. Standing beside her, Keanu understood something just as clearly. Whatever the world chose to call what they shared was irrelevant. What mattered was that together, they had stopped running from meaning. They had chosen presence over protection, intention over fear, and connection over isolation. They had chosen a form of love that didn't demand transformation, only honesty. In time, life would continue to change, as it always did. There would be challenges, moments of doubt, seasons of distance and closeness, but neither of them feared that anymore. They had learned that stability didn't come from certainty, but from trust, trust in themselves, trust in each other, and trust in the quiet strength of living truthfully. On a calm afternoon, long after headlines had faded and attention had moved on, Sandra and Keanu walked through a familiar park, passing people who had no idea who they were or what they carried. A child laughed nearby, a stranger smiled in passing, leaves shifted gently underfoot. Sandra paused, taking in the ordinary beauty of it all, and said softly that she finally understood what the wedding had given her. It hadn't brought back the past. It had given her permission to live fully in the present. Keanu smiled, understanding without needing explanation. He replied that some meetings weren't meant to restart old stories, but to begin wiser ones. They continued walking, unhurried, unguarded, moving forward not because they needed to, but because they chose to. And somewhere, unseen and unrecorded, the quiet light they carried continued to move outward, touching lives neither of them would ever meet, proving that the most powerful stories were not the ones shouted into the world, but the ones lived gently, with intention, and with love that asked for nothing except the courage to remain human.